So we're going to move seamlessly on to Guy Bisson from Ampere, who's going to talk about hot or not, or what's hot or what's not, or something like that. I was at an event with Guy on Tuesday, where Guy was introduced as the Grim Reaper of the analysis community. So I'm hoping this will be sufficiently terrifying to keep us all alert for the coffee break.
Well, we'll try. We'll try. Thank you, John. Okay, what am I going to talk about today? Well, I'm going to try and contextualize where we are in the industry. As analysts, we like to talk a lot about inflection points, something that fundamentally shifts the industry into another gear or another space. And if we think about streaming TV, and it really has had a rather short history if you think about it, there have been a number of inflection points already. So if we think of streaming TV 1.0, we could argue that the launch of Netflix was the thing that kicked off the place that we find ourselves today. Maybe the next thing, streaming TV 2.0, was the move into originals and the way that has caused a shift in lots of high-quality scripted drama, for example, and who is buying and who is selling. And then we've got other things like the entrance of new players, so Amazon and others, that's maybe 3.0. So where are we today? Well, we are on the cusp of another inflection point. And that is, of course, the entrance of the studios, the concept of going direct, and what that might mean for licensing and pulling content off of Netflix and other platforms that nominally compete with these imminent launches from the content owners themselves. So fundamentally, we're at a stage in the streaming market where we need to re-examine the whole concept of what is a channel, what is a platform, and how those two interact with one another. And that's partly, at least, what I'm going to try to do for you today during this presentation. So, UK example, but actually the fundamental structure of streaming TV looks a lot like this in any country that you look at. I've tried to place the UK streaming players on two axes. So our y-axis is how much of a platform they are or how much of a channel they are, and our x-axis is how much they're focused on sort of general thematic space entertainment, so the equivalent of a generalist or thematic channel, and how much they're equivalent of, say, an HBO or a more premium channel. And if we look at the UK market, it's clear that most of the streaming players here, indeed most countries, are at channel analogues. So they're catch-up equivalents of the linear channels. A handful of them, and I'd include Channel 4, or all four in that, and ITV Hub Plus, of course, are BVOD-led, so broadcaster-led, and have, because of what they're doing around exclusive content, around the way that they're dropping box sets like Deutschland 86, for example, on all four, have the potential to edge more towards a platform or a more premium end of the channel market. We have a number of new entrants, so the FANG players in particular. Largely, they are targeting the more niche thematic space. And then in the UK, I would argue there is only one at the moment truly premium aggregation play that brings on linear, brings on streaming, has the sport, has the movies, has the thematics, and that is Now TV from Sky. Amazon is, of course, also an aggregation play, particularly with Amazon channels in the UK, but I'd again argue that it's skewing more to the thematic rather than the premium end of the market. And you'll see, therefore, that there's a nice gap, or nice white space on that graph, and that is sort of slightly down and to the left, or is it right, depending on which way you look at the slide, of Now TV. And I'd argue that that white space is Apple-shaped, because what we did learn from Apple during that fascinating 2 hours, and I did listen to every word, was quite a few interesting things. Firstly, they're going to super aggregate. So it's not just about Apple Plus, their own service, which will feature their originals, but their Apple channels launching, which will be an equivalent or an analog of Amazon channels, bringing on HBO, Showtime, and other streaming channel applications. Device agnostic, so going across Roku, smart TVs, and other devices, as well as, of course, the Apple ecosystem. And for me, the most interesting part of that TV announcement was the fact that you can subscribe, or will be able to subscribe, to your Comcast and your DirecTV and your big traditional cable packages within that ecosystem. So truly a super aggregation play from Apple. Execution, of course, is the challenge, but it's something that Apple are quite good at, and we will see how that plays out. But it is interesting that strategically it's bang on that gap in the market, and I think that's quite a good move from Apple. Now, a lot of analysts have put out research saying that SVoD is complementary to pay TV. And if you look at the numbers simplistically, that does appear to be true, because most people who have a traditional pay TV platform also have SVoD. Most people who have SVoD also have pay TV, so therefore they must be complementary. But what we've done is some analysis looking at all the countries, and that each dot here is a different country. And what it showed was quite a strong correlation between a decline in penetration growth and the penetration of SVoD. And it showed another thing, and that was thresholds. So at up to 10%, the impact on traditional platforms is minimal. Past 15 to 25%, there is a roughly 2.5% penetration loss over how pay TV would have grown had there been no SVoD. And at the threshold of 35% plus, that doubles to a loss of 4% in growth that they would have achieved had there been no SVoD. So there is an impact of SVoD on traditional pay TV. It's not just the US cord cutting, but other markets are suffering a loss in growth over where they should have been had there been no SVoD. So SVoD is not complementary to pay TV. It is cannibalistic. The streaming shift, of course, is about chasing growth. So I've got another slide that I'm not showing today, but it basically pie charts out the entire audiovisual landscape from the cinema forwards through all the windows. And what that shows you is that the streaming market is worth about, or accounts for about 10% of the entire audiovisual landscape, from cinema to video to packaged media to TV. Streaming is about 10%. Everyone is chasing that 10%. But of course, they're not chasing the size today, the 10% market potential today. They're chasing the growth. Because if we look at each of those sectors, you can see that the strong growth markets are SVoD, streaming, subscription television, and AVOD, online advertising and the shift to online. Theatrical is growing, but it's not growing much. Public TV is effectively flat. Pay TV is not growing very strongly either. The packaged media business, of course, is in sharp decline. Where is the growth coming from? It's coming from SVoD and AVOD, and that is what people are chasing. The other thing that they're chasing, and this is particularly true if you think about the studio direct platforms, is global opportunity. Because while North America is still growing, Western Europe is still growing in actual terms, actually, compared to the underlying economic growth, they're slightly underperforming as regions, whereas Asia Pacific is growing very, very strongly. And direct streaming plays allow you to access those markets a little more easily. So global opportunity is the other driver for the streaming shift. What about consumers and what they're doing and their behaviour? Well, there's 100 million things you could say about the consumer. Let's just drill down into a couple of relevant points to the argument I'm going to be putting forward this morning. This is looking at US consumers and their net promoter scores for channel brands. So what that means is how well they think the brand is doing at delivering the service they expect, effectively. And what it shows is that where a lot of the networks, so the free-to-air US networks, there's not much difference between an online consumer and a linear consumer. So that's a consumer who mainly watches their TV online versus one who mainly watches in a linear, traditional fashion. When it comes to the studio brands, the big studio brands like HBO, Showtime, ESPN, Stars, the online viewers actually rate them more highly. Now that's a little counterintuitive because you tend to think that they've made the shift, or they think about Netflix, they think about Amazon, which they do, they rate those brands even more highly, but they still see power and opportunity, and they still like those studio brands, so they have power among those online shift consumers. The other good news when you're thinking about the streaming transition and the opportunity in that market is that people who have made the shift online, who mainly watch TV online, watch more telly. They just watch less of it in a linear fashion. So they're layering in more ways of watching. They watch more free online video, more SVoD, more catch-up, more off their DVR. It's just less linear. But hours per day, hours and minutes per day, they're actually watching more. So they're a stronger TV viewer, not a weaker one. And the other key driver in the market today, and a push behind some of the theories I'm going to talk about later, is the demographic shift. So while we obviously think about the streaming transition as a millennial thing, or now increasingly a Gen Z thing, actually the strong growth in this behaviour, in non-linear behaviour and in online shift, is among the older age group. So this is in just 1 year in the US, the decline in viewing of linear among 45 to 64-year-olds. Pretty significant drop in just 1 year. And actually, one of Netflix's core growth markets is this age group, because they've pretty much saturated the younger age group. And that also has fundamental implications for positioning and for content strategy that we're going to come on to in a second. So if we've established why there's so much interest in streaming, why this transition is happening, what the drivers are, so chasing growth, looking for global opportunity, addressing the needs of consumers, including those increasingly shifting older consumers. All of the studios, or at least most of the majors, are looking at going direct. So while I just went through a lot of the consumer positives and drivers, there's a cloud on the horizon, a consumer cloud on the horizon. This isn't the cloud, this is still the good news. So we haven't got onto the Grim Reaper bit yet. Stacking. So we know that people who take SVoD services these days, they're not just taking one service. Indeed, in the US, only 1 in 3 SVoD households takes only one SVoD service. The other 70% take at least 2, and often considerably more than 2. The other thing is, in all the markets that we track, and we now do detailed consumer surveys in more than 20 countries, the stacking rate for SVoD has been growing every 6 months. So we look at it every 6 months, and we've been doing this since 2015. Not surprising, you may say, people take more and more SVoD services. But buried in this rather busy bar chart is this, and this is the cloud. And the cloud is that if we look at high penetration SVoD markets, so largely saturated SVoD markets, the rate of stacking has bottomed out, or topped out, I guess. So over 2, 3, 4 quarters in some cases, the number of SVoD services per SVoD home has not increased at all. And that includes the USA, it includes the Nordic markets, which are heavily penetrated with SVoD. Now, there are a number of reasons for this, you could argue. One might be the content on offer, the services on offer, that there aren't any more that people want to take. So there are ways that we can potentially break through this ceiling. And again, we'll talk about that. But before we do, this, I think, is an interesting point and trend and something that could help break through that ceiling. So again, having looked at consumers now over many years and their attitudes towards SVoD, going back a couple of years, we tended to see two types of transitionary consumer. You had very price-sensitive consumers who were either cord nevers or had ditched their traditional TV and just gone to Netflix because it was £7 and that did for them, and they were very price-sensitive and they didn't want to spend 20, 30 quid in Europe or 100 in the US, and they were one end of the market driven by price. At the other end of the market, you had price-insensitive consumers, and they were the ones who had their Sky or their DirecTV, and they took Netflix, and they probably took other services as well. They didn't really care about the cost. They were more interested in the set-top box and what that could do for them and other things, price-insensitive. In the middle now, we have these stackers who have started to make the transition away from traditional, but are taking 3, 4, maybe 5 SVoD services. Interestingly, they are closest in spend attitude towards your traditional pay TV subscribers, so they're a lot less price sensitive. Now, the opportunity, of course, is for those pay TV customers, the least price sensitive of all, to come into the transitionary streaming market and release a large amount of spend into that market. And when that happens, that's another factor that could break us through that apparent ceiling that we seem to have hit in the number of services people are willing to stack. So, drilling down again into some consumer data, and just in the UK, we can see that there are 3 fundamental types of viewer or customer. Thematic channel viewers in the UK, about 70% of the population. SVoD subscribers, about 70% of the population. Taking both and regularly using broadcast to catch up is 14% of the UK population. So they're the old and the new aggregators. We've got super aggregators who take SVoD, thematic channels, and regularly use BVOD. They're 39% of the population, so the biggest segment. And then we've got the most interesting in a way. They've fundamentally made the transition because they don't take traditional thematic subscriptions, but they do take SVoD and they do regularly use BVOD. So they in a way, are the streaming aggregators, the future of TV when we think about a streaming transition. So 12% of the UK population. That is why Apple's streaming aggregation strategy makes so much sense. Because what it does, if they can do what they've said they do, and I believe they can do it in the US, whether they can replicate the opportunity to bring traditional pay TV on platform in the 100 markets they've said they're going to launch in, that's another question. But if they can, that's why their super aggregation strategy makes most sense, because they're hitting that big segment at the moment of people who take SVoD and traditional thematic channels and BVOD, and they're addressing the needs of the streaming aggregators, that are another 12%, who just use streaming and BVOD. So a market opportunity of nearly 60% with the Apple aggregation strategy. So what about the content story and what's been happening out there in terms of content? Well, a lot of the things Jack was referring to have been the driver behind this trend. Jack started his presentation by talking about M&A activity, and that, of course, has been a big factor in the industry in the last year. But while all those big, mega, multi-billion-dollar deals have been going on, there's another trend that's been happening. And it's similar to the trend that happens with my belly, and that is getting a bit bigger around the middle. And what it involves is often not M&A activity, but a company or a business or a group that was fundamentally in one segment of the value chain, the production, distribution, finance value chain, and has increasingly moved sideways into adjacent parts of that chain, effectively to become commissioners, financiers, producers, and distributors, or in another word, mini studios. BBC, for example, ITV, large distributors like Beta Film, Banijay, talent agencies like WME, CAA, and large producer distributors, E1, Fremantle, etc. I would argue even that Netflix has deployed this strategy, going from its initial position as a consumer-facing distributor of content backwards to become effectively a studio. What are they doing? Well, they're obviously taking advantage of the market opportunity around the demand for high-end content. They're also filling the hole that has been left by the major studios. So the Warners and Disneys of this world have increasingly shifted towards big budget and franchise movies in particular, leaving another market opportunity for these new mini studios. So that has been another driver in the content industry. The casualty in the business, in the value chain, is pure play distribution. Pure play distribution is going to be an increasingly difficult space to operate in, because if you don't create and control the rights fully, it's a very difficult position in today's market with the drivers around streaming and the demands of streaming platforms around those rights and the access to content. And I would argue that that includes pure play consumer-facing distribution, i.e. being a platform that gets the content to the end consumer but doesn't control or own the content. And again, that's another driver for the direct move by the content owners themselves, because it allows them to go across and backwards and forwards through that value chain. So a big shift in the industry. And of course, content becomes the key battleground, and it is the key battleground because in a streaming world, and an increasingly crowded streaming world, it's the clearest way to differentiate. And when we combine that with the concept that I'm about to talk about around channel families, it allows the channel, the streaming channel or the linear traditional channel, to re-secure an otherwise drifting audience. So let's think about content or the content offer of a channel or a streaming service and what it is influenced by today. Number one, of course, is viewer fragmentation. And that is simply a factor of there being more and more players. So not just SVoD versus linear, streaming versus traditional, but now the streaming market is so incredibly crowded that even Netflix viewing is in decline within a Netflix home. Amazon viewing is in decline in an Amazon home. The SVoD players are facing the same challenge that channel groups faced 20 years ago. Increasing direct competition, that has a number of implications, not just further viewer fragmentation, but a licensing and content access challenge as well. And then we have the changing demographics. So where Netflix and Amazon perhaps were able to focus their content and production commissioning and acquisition on stuff that satisfied 20 and 30-year-olds, that is no longer good enough because their growth is not coming from 20 and 30-year-olds. As we saw, it's coming from 40 and 50-year-olds. So let's work through some of those points. Firstly, viewer fragmentation. So it's a pretty simple equation. People who have one SVoD service, they watch 1 hour 35 of SVoD content a day. People who have 2, they watch more, as you might expect. But it's not much more, it's only 10 minutes more. And people who have 3, they watch a bit more too, but it's only 5 minutes more than those who have 2. So the point being, as you stack more and more services, the viewing goes up, as you'd expect, but it doesn't go up much. And therefore, the implication is that the viewing time opportunity per service declines very, very rapidly once you add a second and third SVoD service. That is the new facing up to the old. And the old, of course, is back 20 years ago. For those of you who've been watching the industry for that length of time, you'll remember 20 years ago, there was a mass panic about disruption. And it was disruption called digital television. And we suddenly went from 5 channels to 50 to 100 to 500. And everyone was in a panic about what that was going to do to their viewer base, to their advertising opportunity, etc., etc. Sounds rather familiar. Now, we solved that one, or the industry solved that one, by launching channel families. So moving away from having one core brand like MTV to having multiple like MTV Rock, MTV Classic, VH1, MTV Trace, etc., etc. Each one demographically targeted, clawing back some of that fragmented viewer base and spreading the opportunity to engage the end viewer. We're back there today with the streaming services. So they're facing the same challenge. What's the solution? Well, I'd suggest that the solution lies somewhere similar to where it lay with the channel business. Not quite the same way, and I'll tell you why it's not quite the same in a minute. So as with the channel business, when digital led to the proliferation of brands, we're back there with SVoD. The concept of the channel family and the niche opportunity needs to come back into the industry. And that becomes a driver for content differentiation. So the next factor that was on our content pressure chart was direct-to-consumer competition. And the trouble with this, of course, is that the core of this shift is a potential for a change in the power balance. So there's been a long dynamic, a well-understood dynamic between content, channel, and platform or distribution. And there is now an opportunity because of this shift for existing players to either change that dynamic or exploit it. Let's look at each of the big direct-to-consumer plays that we know about today, all of which have been recently changed or augmented by a massive merger. The key, I think, to understanding where these direct plays will position is the old proverb, "He who pays the piper calls the tune." And it becomes quite clear if you simply take the P&L and the balance sheets of the companies and you merge them together and you look at who's paying the piper. Think about AT&T, Time Warner. Warner Media is a tiny slither of their business because their main business is mobile telephony and fixed line telephony in the domestic US market. And that will influence the way that they approach the direct-to-consumer market. They will not jump in feet first in the way that Disney will. They will look at strategies that help to bolster and support the parent company's core business without cannibalizing. Comcast, NBC, Universal, similar, but not to the same degree as AT&T, Time Warner. So domestic US cable, of course, is the piper in that business, or the payer of the piper in that business. Even with Sky, that still remains the case, but not to the degree that AT&T is embedded in domestic infrastructure. So they will roll out somewhat more aggressively, using Now TV, as we know, as an international brand to roll out direct consumer, while still, of course, protecting the Sky business and the Comcast business and that traditional pay TV. So a more gradual transition. The only company jumping in feet first will be Disney Fox, because Disney has always been the content is king strategist, and with Fox that becomes even more so. So they will be the one to watch in terms of where the direct consumer market heads. So the content is king mindset means a fairly rapid, and by fairly rapid I still think it's a 10-year transition, and we've done some modelling around that, but a fairly rapid transition towards a streaming replacement of the traditional pay TV business for Disney. So, what's the next step? We've talked about how the market is becoming increasingly crowded, how stacking of SVoD is potentially topping out, although there are factors, as I've highlighted, that will allow us to break through that ceiling. But we have got a raft of new studio-led players about to enter the market. To date, streaming TV has been largely driven, and the agenda set largely by one business model, and that is subscription. We're at the point in time, as we think about diversification, as we think about breaking through the ceiling, as we think about fragmenting viewership, where we need to explore alternative business models. Not alternative in them not being understood, because they are well understood, but alternative in them being not necessarily subscription. So increasingly, AVOD is the next big growth area for channel groups, content owners, and direct consumer mixed plays. And that speaks back to the channel family opportunity. Not just a family of streaming services, but a family of business models. So the licensing challenge. So this is some new analysis we've been doing around individual show titles. And it's a algorithmically generated measure of the power of a show to an SVoD platform, basically, based on interest in the show and demand of the show among demand for the show among consumers. This is just US, by the way. What it shows is a number of interesting things. One, that SVoD shows that have had a linear heritage are the most powerful, i.e. they're the most popular and have the most interest. SVoD originals that have gone straight to original are very, very popular, but have less longevity and impact. And bang in the middle, if you see below the orange circle, things like Criminal Minds, The Simpsons, Vikings, The Voice, and a few reality shows in there, Jersey Shore, America's Got Talent, studio-driven shows, Friends in particular, are still extremely powerful to the SVoD players. They, of course, are the shows that are at risk. The other problem, I guess, with SVoD originals is this one. If you look at interest and how the impact of that show, it has a very, very short window of 3 to 5 weeks. And that, of course, is the way that they're dropped straight to box sets means they have a short, sharp burst, and then the interest wanes very quickly. Now, as you'll remember from the previous graph, that doesn't apply so much to studio shows or shows that have had that heritage on a linear platform. So as studio content begins to get pulled off SVoD, there's an impending problem. Looking at those studios we were just looking at, so Universal, Disney, Warner, Fox, 17% of Netflix's US catalogue comes from those studios, is licensed from those studios. So that is the at-risk content. Think about their plays today, their direct-to-consumer plays, if you like. HBO Go is Warner's play. I'll say Now TV is Universal's play. Hulu is the Disney play, if you like. And then we have Netflix and Amazon. Let's pull all of their content back into their own libraries. So all the content they license to other streaming players, they're going to pull back into their own libraries. And what that means is that Hulu becomes by far the biggest platform when Disney, Fox pull their content back into that Hulu platform. And that does not count any content that's licensed in the linear space that they might also begin to pull back. To date, though, only Disney and Fox have been reducing catalogue licensed on Netflix. So there's no evidence that the other studios have started to do that. That may be to do with the duration of their contracts, that there just hasn't been an opportunity to pull content, but there has been a concerted effort from Disney and Fox that is evidence in the data to decline their content on Netflix. So what are the content strategies looking like in this increasingly difficult and crowded market? Well, firstly, the money. So Netflix is already spending equivalent to a big US network or cable channel group. Amazon has a little way to go, although it is also spending big. Apple and Facebook, everyone's talking about, they've got a very, very long way to go, around $1 billion each spent on content on their original strategy to date. But if we look at the change in Netflix's catalogue over the last few quarters, a couple of these challenges become evident. Firstly, look at the children's content. That's been declining rapidly on Netflix, except the last quarter when they began to claw back a bit. And that is despite the fact that a lot of their acquisition of newest titles and a number of their originals are children's titles. Now, the reason, of course, is Disney and others pulling content off. So they're fighting an uphill struggle to keep children's content on their platform. The other thing that's very clear from this is the genre diversification. So crime and thriller dropping a bit, but reality, although still small, is one of the segments that's been growing very, very strongly. And that talks to their diversification strategy around content. Because if you're Netflix, you don't have to launch multiple brands, as we used to have to do in the linear channel business. You can have the same effect through catalogue curation. And so reality and factual has been a key growth area for Netflix because it's effectively employing a channel family strategy through content curation, not through the launch of multiple brands. And you can see that very clearly just looking over the last couple of years. Reality and factual has gone from about 5% of catalogue originals to 17%, so a very significant increase in non-scripted content on Netflix. And that's not just Netflix, because this is a look at over 100 SVoD country combinations. You can see that the really big change has been in documentary and reality. So we've gone from a market, and it's all about addressing audiences beyond millennials who are happy with a bit of sci-fi and a bit of comedy. And now it's about period drama, crime drama. But look at the really big growth areas, documentary and reality. So bringing in that new demographic. It's channel family diversification. Now, the other big factor, of course, is the original strategy. And as more and more studio content does get pulled off, clearly the originals become even more important. I haven't got the figure off the top of my head, but it's 86% odd of Netflix's total catalogue is acquired. Although we talk about the originals all the time, 86% plus is acquired. And when you look at the whole catalogue, sometimes the originals get a bit lost in that when you try to look at the strategy. But if you look at content that is a year or less old, the impact is massive. More than 70% of all the content less than a year old on Netflix is their own content. So the impact in that cutting edge of new stuff is incredibly big for Netflix. And that, of course, is going to be increasingly so as they move forward. And contrary to Amazon, the originals are very impactful for Netflix. So of their top 15 shows, 30% of them are their own originals. Whereas the number, this is again based on our affinity rating, but for Amazon, it's a very different story. Only 2% of their 15 top titles are their own shows, the rest are acquired. So they are much, much more reliant on licensed content and potentially more impacted by the studio direct consumer move. And that is why an aggregation strategy for them makes a lot more sense than for Netflix. I'm going to have to go a bit quickly now because we're down to the last 4 minutes. Okay, Netflix is commissioning double the number of shows. This is forward commissioning, not what they have made, but what they've got in development at the moment. Double the amount of the next biggest US network. But interestingly, they're exactly on a par with the US networks for US produced original content. So they're just like a big US network, and then they've got a whole stack more that's going or being made in international markets to satisfy that international consumer base. The interesting thing is when you peg Netflix against the other FANG players, firstly, of course, they're much bigger. So this is current catalogue, 349 Netflix original titles. And they've got nearly 300 in production and development right now. The other big growth, of course, is Apple, but it's tiny compared to Netflix. And just to put that in perspective, Netflix is 8 times ahead of Apple in terms of its forward commissioning. So Apple would have to increase 8-fold just to be up to where Netflix is in terms of its shows in development. Amazon about 3-fold to catch up with where Netflix is in terms of its shows in development. It just puts it in perspective how much of a driver Netflix is in the content market today and how it sets that agenda. Again, looking at each of the FANGs and their forward production slate, though, tells us quite an interesting story about where they're targeting. So you can see Google for YouTube heavily skewed for youth-focused comedy. Facebook Watch heavily skewed to factual and reality. And Apple, although we've only got 32 titles to analyse, look at the colours and the height of the bars, it looks a lot like a Netflix or an Amazon. So it shows you where that Apple Plus is being positioned. Bang on the market, largely scripted content, a lot of sci-fi, crime, drama content, bang on the Netflix, Amazon sweet spot. So let's conceptualize that now against some of the linear schedules. And what you might see is, again, trying to look at the colors, the amount of content in each genre. Facebook Watch is kind of a MTV. YouTube is kind of a Comedy Central. Netflix is kind of a US network like the CW, or Apple is going after that same space as well. So what I would argue is that in the midst of disruption comes order. Because of the point that we're at in the market, we're seeing a fundamental shift back to the old ways. Everything that's new has become old again because the drivers and pressures of disruption have come back full circle. And yes, we are in a transitionary phase, and we're not there yet, clearly. So there's a lot of fighting, a lot of thinking, a lot of strategic shifting that still has to go on. But fundamentally, we're returning back to where we were with the channel business. So we've got a viewer fragmentation. We need to address that. We've got business model diversification. We've got the concept of the channel family. Disney is going to be Disney Plus, ESPN, Hulu. Warner, similar, a number of channel brands within the streaming space. So all of these direct streaming platforms, re-embracing that concept of the family, of the channel family. And so I would argue that although we're at a fascinating time in terms of disruption, the business models that we need to address that disruption are already in place. And it's just about bringing back that thinking to the wider market, even when you think about the FANGs, because when you look at their content strategy, you can see even they are positioned firmly in that channel market. And with that, and with the alarm going off, I guess I better shut up and let John ask a question.
Well, thank you very much for that huge amount of data, and genuinely much less pessimistic than I thought it was going to be. And also fabulous to see SpongeBob SquarePants still doing so well on various charts. Any questions? I'm sure everyone's desperate for coffee, if not alcohol. We could probably do a question. Anyone with a question? Sir, can we give, if the nice lady in green can sprint or walk at speed, maybe.
Hi, yes, Tony Russell from True Vision. There's always inevitably these comments of massive amount of talk about Netflix because they're doing so many innovative things that are driving so much of the change in the industry. But from what I think we can see, that right now they're not really making much money and they have a giant amount of debt. When do you think that's going to change anytime soon? Do you think they're going to have to spend more and more and more to compete against the big players that are now going direct to consumer and win content off them?
So clearly they're going to have to at least maintain their spend at the sort of levels we're seeing, and yes, probably increase it. Another little model we did and we put out a short report on was looking at the ARPU increase that they need to wipe out their free cash flow deficit. And I'll tell you what the magic number is. The magic number is $1.67. Now, that represents about a 30% growth in ARPU, which sounds like an awful lot, but $1.67 doesn't sound like an awful lot. And that was before their $2 price rise. So basically, with the $2 price rise, as that rolls out, they can very quickly start to reduce their free cash flow deficit, which will put them in a much stronger position to at least maintain content spend. So the answer is, I think, it's not as grim as some of the analysis suggests. It's about basically, the analogy I make is that they're a TV company run like an internet company. And in the internet space, in the .com world, we're all used to people not worrying about money, but worrying about customer acquisition and then worrying about money. I think that's what they're doing. They're shifting from a customer growth story to a ARPU growth story. And when that transition begins, which it has begun, it will look very different.
Things are getting positively cheery now. Done. Right, a massive thank you, Guy. That was great.